All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dean Ernsten from the University of Notre Dame, and I'm a Higher Education Advisory Council member and the moderator for this session. We're excited to welcome you, and we'll be learning about Harvard's faculty search process from Patrick McNeal and Jennifer Jackson. While they're doing their presentation, I'll be monitoring the session chat, which can be found just to the right of the presentation screen in the upper corner. Now I'll turn it over to Patrick and Jennifer to get things started.
Great, Dean. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Patrick McNeal, and I'm the Salesforce product owner at the Harvard Medical School, where I oversee a team working on Salesforce-specific issues as part of our information systems group. Administrative use cases that span different business units across the school. In terms of my background, I've always worked in higher education, previously at MIT, and before that, the University of Michigan. And I've been working on the Salesforce platform probably for about 7 or 8 years. I try to think back to the Dreamforce concerts, and I can remember back to U2 for sure. So looking forward to sharing our story with you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. And originally, when we had proposed this topic, it was before Omicron had raised its ugly head, and we were hoping to be able to see all of you. But since we can't be together, at least we have technology here today. I want to thank Patrick for the introduction, and Dean and Frank for all of their technical support, and all of the crew members for making today possible. It's an exciting topic, and we hope that we can answer a lot of questions later on in the session. So I'm Jen Jackson. I'm the Director of Information Systems at Harvard Medical School. And the way I like to describe our portfolio is we support all the administrative technology that run the business, the medical school, the business of the medical school. So HR, finance, research administration, faculty affairs, medical education, graduate education, institutional policy and planning, and faculty affairs, and and facilities. So I have been in the higher ed community for a little bit over 20 years, and 14 of those years I spent in Harvard University Central Administration, supporting financials, grants management, and human resource systems. So these were like the monolithic ERP systems that still exist today, such as Oracle e-Business Suite, PeopleSoft, Human Capital Management, and we have a grants management custom application that follows the pre and post-award life cycle of a sponsored project. And so about 14 years into being at Harvard, I had what I like to call an identity crisis, wondering, well, am I only successful because I work at Harvard and I have a really big network of who to go to and ask questions to and get help from, or are my skills actually transferable in the outside world? And so I left for 4.5 years. I went over to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, where I supported the sales and underwriting division. And part of my portfolio included the implementation of Salesforce, Sales Cloud, and Service Cloud to their sales and account service division. And so throughout that experience, I was really enamored by the Salesforce platform. Whenever I went to Dreamforce, I kept dreaming about, wow, if only we had had Salesforce when we spent 4 years building a custom grants management application in the early 2000s. Like how quick would that have project been instead of custom coding so much of it? And so when the opportunity came up at the Harvard Medical School and a colleague of mine referred me to apply, my main platform when I was going through the interview process was I didn't want to leave the Salesforce platform. Instead, I wanted to bring the Salesforce platform to the Harvard Medical School in support of administrative use cases. And so I knew that Harvard Medical School already had a Salesforce platform supporting external education, but they weren't yet using it for administrative use cases. And so after joining, I soon was introduced to Corey Snow, who may or may not be on today's session. He at the time was working in Harvard Central. We didn't overlap, but we got to know each other, and then he introduced me to some higher ed folks already on the Salesforce platform. He introduced me to Alana Steffens from Attain. We'll talk about them later on in the session. And also in 2019, that's when I met Patrick McNeal at the Higher Ed Summit in San Diego. And unfortunately, that was the last in-person session that we got to go to. So next slide, Patrick. Originally, I had a bunch of animation on this slide, and I decided, you guys aren't here to hear about Harvard Medical School. You're really here to talk about how we're using Salesforce. And so I want to focus in on the picture on the right. This is a picture of the Harvard Medical School, and it's also known by us as on-quad. So this is the on-quad location of the medical school that's on the Boston side of the Charles River. We're not located in Cambridge with the rest of the university. Instead, we're located more closer to where the hospitals are. And so when we look at this picture, this is primarily going to consist of the research labs and the classrooms where the first and second year students go for didactic training in a classroom setting with a faculty member. And then starting in year 3 is when they begin their clinical rotations out in the hospitals. And so if you're a medical student, you get the opportunity to rotate. You might start out in pediatrics and then go to oncology and then go to surgery. And ultimately, by the end of your medical school journey, you get to specialize in a medical specialty. And so the tricky part about the medical school is that our on-quad faculty, there's only about 193 of them who actually have primary locations on quad. And the rest of the 12,000 faculty at the medical school are actually, their primary locations are in the hospitals. And another tricky part about the medical school is we are one of only a few medical schools in the country that don't own our own hospital. And so these faculty, these 12,000 faculty that are out in the hospitals are actually on the hospital payroll, not on Harvard's payroll. And if you can imagine, each hospital has their own HR process, their own applicant tracking system for resumes to be uploaded to. They have their own hiring practices. And so we have, within the 15 affiliated hospitals, we have about 56 clinical departments within each of those hospitals. And so keeping track of who's coming and going between the hospitals, a lot of these clinicians have joint appointments at dual hospitals. And so it becomes very tricky from a customer relationship management perspective. So moving on to the next slide. So Faculty Affairs had received a grant, and then HMS also added some strategic funding to really pull together some thought leaders across the quad and across the affiliates to really look at the process and of how we are appointing our faculty. Because once what was happening is these HR units at the hospitals were doing their own position searches, making offers to doctors, and then they were then sending the paperwork over to HMS, the Harvard Medical School, and asking for the faculty to then become an appointed faculty member to have abilities to work with students and in a teaching and learning environment in the clinical setting. And so instead, we wanted to look at how do we put together a consistent process across all of the affiliates and the Harvard Medical School to improve the quality of the search, allow for better transparency and visibility into the search as it's going on, not after the fact, and then collect better metrics around diversity and inclusion. And so part of the project is what we're here today to talk about, which is the technology part of the project. But there was a whole other arm to the project that focused in on training of putting together materials for unconscious bias training, putting together best practices during a faculty search, putting together training around behavioral interviewing for those who are sitting on the search committee, understanding where we're sourcing candidates from, and making sure that advertisements are put in places where we might seek diverse candidates, instead of always going to the same locations and pulling from the same candidate pool. And so ultimately, in our Dean's report that was just released a few weeks ago, the Dean spoke to devising a novel faculty search approach to prioritize scientific excellence and achievement, along with demonstrated commitment to the school's institutional values of diversity and inclusion, with the goal to increase the number of faculty underrepresented in medicine and improving the coordination of diversity efforts between the Harvard Medical School and its affiliated hospitals. So it's really exciting to see when one of your projects that you're working on get all the way up to the dean level and communicated out through such a widely publicized communication. So next slide. So this is the high-level business process that we worked through. First, the departments are asking for permission to open a search, and then the Faculty Affairs Office approves that, yes, we're going to open up a faculty search. The department then will invite committee members onto the search committee. And at that moment in time, we're also looking at the diversity of the committee. So who is making up that committee? And then what advertisements are they drafting? Where are they placing those advertisements? Those all then get approved through the Office for Faculty Affairs before they're published. Then the committee conducts their business. They go off and interview candidates. They are then able to look at who the candidate pool is, both in the long list and the short list of candidates. There is an effort at that time to make sure that there are underrepresented in medicine candidates and women candidates. Those are two of the categories explicitly being tracked. The candidate is then selected, and then there's an end of search report produced. And Patrick is going to speak to this a little bit more in his slides. But ultimately, we want a record of the entire search process so that over time, we can look at the metrics and see that we're moving the needle and really looking at our candidate pool with an eye towards diversity and inclusion. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Patrick, who's going to talk about our technical design and some of the challenges that we faced.
Great, thanks, Jen. Before I leave this slide here, I did just want to reiterate Jen's point of the end of search report. That was a key part of this project and comes up quite a few times in the technical design and some of the challenge we faced. I like to think of it as the carrot that brings people into the application, since it's something they needed to generate themselves. By doing it automatically in the system, we're hoping that there's a value added to encourage people to utilize the system as we intended. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this, and I'll mention it in a few slides here. So to start the technical design challenges section, I first want to just give you a high-level 10,000-foot overview of our environment that we built this on and the application itself. In the middle, we're using Salesforce. It's an EDA-based Salesforce. And we have a single org that is shared across HMSIT. So if the faculty search is not the only application running in our instance, and there are shared data elements that go between these different applications. But for the purposes of faculty search, we offer two interfaces to it. For those hospital staff that are from our network of affiliated hospitals, they're entering through an Experience Cloud portal. And then our internal staff, mainly the Office for Faculty Affairs, is logging in with traditional Service Cloud accounts directly into the native Salesforce application. On the left indicating some of the data feeds that we have coming in. Harvard is providing us with a feed of HR data via what they call the Person Data Service. They've actually developed a tool and implementation that loads data into Salesforce. I believe the last I heard, we have about 56 orgs across the university. So they have this core architecture that they provide. Includes information on students, faculty, and staff, pulling data from PeopleSoft, along with our internal IAM systems. That's going to bring in contact details, departmental information, emails, historic roles, kind of that core CRM data we're looking for. But looking more at HMS, we also have different data elements that are unique to the medical school. So we're also bringing those in from our own data lake, and those get layered on top of those existing records that are coming in from. And the last one is iPads, which was a new data source we identified as part of this project to bring in information about universities and colleges from across the United States. And I'll get into more detail in that later. On the right, we have Conga in the end of search report. That is the piece generating that document. We're using Conga as the third-party solution to generate the documents that then also get saved back into Salesforce. So that whole loop that Jen had up on the screen, not really the whole business process there, gets fed back into Salesforce, and Salesforce has become the system of record, where before things were in spreadsheets, emails, and in different Dropbox folders. Now everything has been coalesced back into Salesforce. It's always good to acknowledge backup. We do have disaster recovery. We're using own backup to provide that. Knock on wood, I've never had to use it, but it is there if we needed to. Just to give you a sense of what the app looks like, this is the portal, the community cloud or the experience cloud-based portal that our hospital administrators log into. We can't assume they've ever seen Salesforce before, so we tried to make this as common of a web experience as possible. We are leveraging standard Salesforce templates with very few modifications in there to expose those records as needed. And then on the Salesforce side, this is kind of the tail end of the process. We did a lot of work around reporting and dashboards to give our stakeholders a quick snapshot of where their searches are at. This is the kind of information that they could calculate before, but since the data was all in all those different systems, it would take quite a bit of time. So I also think this is one of the value adds. You know, the dream world is the dean actually would log in and be able to look at this themselves. Who knows if we'll get there, but we're starting to get to the point where we have these higher level views that our administrators could be interested in. And then just a snapshot of a kind of fakes end of search report. This is using the standard template that they have to use. So once they get all the data in there, they don't have to worry about formatting, tabs, and spacing. We will populate it for them. They can generate both a Word document. Some users found it easier to work in Word just in terms of reviewing it, maybe making comments so they knew what they had to update in Salesforce, but ultimately ends up as a PDF that gets saved within the Salesforce system. So now diving into some of the technical challenges here. So back to that single org piece. With a single org, we've got multiple stakeholders, different applications, different user personas, all sitting within the same system. And because we're not doing a lot of customizations, kind of with the same user experience. And since some of our staff have multiple personas, we have to keep into consideration that experience. We don't want it to change too much between applications. And so if they're familiar with one, they should hopefully be familiar with another one. Of course, data sensitivity. Anytime we're talking about PII, we have to think about who can see it, when they can see it, what they can do with it. And being a shared system, that gets even more complicated because this data coming in for faculty search is quite sensitive. Nobody else should be seeing that. So we had to really think about the data architecture for it. And supporting all of this is a single Salesforce team within IT. We do bring in a TAIN or a consultant when we can to help out with some bigger projects, but for ongoing work, it is one team. And we have to be cognizant of our own resources. So how did we address those challenges for the single org? First, we focused on that core architecture, understanding that is going to be the base that everything is built on. We wanted to make sure that the data models supported the business needs we knew at the time, and even tried to plan ahead of future use cases we see coming down the road to future-proof us for those. Being a smaller shop, also leveraging in that core architecture as much off-the-shelf work as possible. We are EDA-based, and then on top of that, we have that Harvard data architecture sitting on top of it, and trying to minimize the HMS modifications as much as possible. I mentioned the user experience, that we are leveraging or using the standard built-in Salesforce whenever possible. For the data security, we strategically have decided to default to private organization-wide defaults. That's almost a conceptual way of coming to any project we have, is we just assume they're going to be private. We're going to assume nobody has access to anything. That helps set us up to make sure that we're not sharing things that shouldn't be shared. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule. We have some data at the university that is considered truly public, and we are able to share that widely within our Salesforce org. So those do have more open organization-wide defaults. But for those private records or more data sensitive records, we're using shared groups and permission sets to control, based off of a persona, what they should be able to do, both in terms of what objects they should be able to see and then the underlying records that they should have access to. And with the team that we have, we're agile based. And it's been quite helpful that we're doing a 2-week sprint cycle. So we have all of these different projects, and when faculty search was happening, it was the biggest one we had. It would consume much of that 2-week sprint. But as we've gone into maintenance for the application, we can allot a few points to faculty search, making sure there's a carve out that we have time for it, and then putting a nice bound around how much work we've done on a particular application, case faculty search. Another one, licensing. It's kind of amazing. For as long as I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem, licensing still is challenging and confusing to me. Users with multiple roles, many external users, of course, tight budgets and concern for future growth. I guess it's a downside of your own success as you have more users coming onto your platform. But also these different third-party tools that we have all have their own different licensing models. So first tip on this one, definitely work with your account executive. I have found ours to be particularly helpful of understanding what's there, getting some ideas around using license in a different way that I wasn't aware of before, and really trying to understand our business needs and matching it to those licenses to find that you are getting the right set of features to meet your needs. For me, it was helpful. I created an actual model, an Excel spreadsheet that documented all of our options, all of the different licensing methodologies, and the different personas that we have. That helped me, one, determine what the actual cost of a Salesforce user is, because it's not just the Salesforce licensing, it's those third-party ones on top of it, but also the different licensing. Should we be using a login license versus should we be using a name license for Experience Clouds? Also, getting to that next point there, Experience Cloud licensing is the most complicated one that I've run into. There are many different options in there. Login versus name. Login is assigned to a pool of users, and it only costs you money when they log in, versus a name license is assigned to a specific person, and they just have it more of a traditional Salesforce license. The tipping point we found is about 3 logins a month. So if the user is logging in more than 3 times in a given month to an Experience Cloud-based site, it's more cost effective to have a name license. The trick is our users have quite a dynamic range of usage. Maybe 1 month they're very active and the remainder of months they're not. So we haven't quite mastered that quickly, but we do have the flexibility of going back and forth between those 2 licenses. It's worth noting in those licenses as well, there are some object limits. If you have lots of custom objects, you need to be considered how many you're going to be exposing within the Experience Cloud. You have the option of adding on more, but again, that just adds more costs. And then each license does have a different set of platform features. Are your users going to need access to reporting and dashboards or complicated sharing rules? Those business decisions will help drive you towards the correct licensing option. Another technical challenge we ran into was around data sources. I talked about at the beginning of this that we have multiple data sources. Not necessarily all of that gives us enough information on the contacts. So for faculty search, many of them are related to people already in the Harvard community, but you can imagine we have applicants, we have possibly committee members who don't exist within Harvard source systems. So we needed some mechanism to allow us to also track those. And in our pilot phase, we started to see some lower quality, not the greatest quality, around either entering duplicate records or not completely filling them out for non-Harvard accounts. And to highlight this, I wanted to dive back into that search report and show you this small section of it and pull back in the different data sources we use to get there. So this little list here is a list of the long candidates. These are the candidates that were considered before they were gone further down the process. It's part of that formatted report. And first, we wanted to develop an ETL process to bring in some of those data elements that we didn't have from our different source systems. And this is the example here is we have their degree. So Harvard was not giving this to us, and they needed to identify the terminal degree. Within the medical school, we have our own data warehouse that does have that information. So we were able to bring that in, put that on top of the model we have, and bring it into contact. So as our users of faculty search were selecting their people, if they were part of the Harvard community, they would not have to enter their degree information. To help with that problem of contacts who aren't part of Harvard, we introduced something we're calling external contacts. And this is where Salesforce is the system of record for information about these people. Technically speaking, we have two record types. External is open. People can create contacts as external. We try to have some duplicate rules to prevent them from either creating duplicate external contacts or Harvard contacts as well. But as a shared system, it is starting to create a pool of contacts that people can use, and we're starting to create more of that 360 view, not just of our Harvard contacts, but of our external ones as well. And that's an example here where this contact came in, this applicant came in from Yale, not part of the Harvard system. Somebody went ahead and entered them directly. The last piece is around the data quality issue around accounts. Is we ended up identifying, for me, it was a new data source called IPEDS. This is a data source that comes from the Department of Education. It is a free and openly available. It's based off of an annual survey that goes out to any institution in the US that's receiving money for financial aids from the federal government, and provides just a wealth of information. We're using just a small piece of it right here, that the format dictated that you had to have the city, comma, state. And we realized if you select Stanford University, we wanted to pre-populate that, but we didn't want to have to enter the information ourselves. So we brought in IPEDS. I forget the exact number of records, but it is many thousands of accounts that were created for us automatically. We will be updating it manually. With an ETL job every year. The data doesn't get updated from the federal government very often. And as a new data source, I actually got quite excited about it. So I just wanted to show you to maybe get your gears going about how you could possibly use this data. This is a record for Yale that was brought over from IPEDS. Basic information about phone number, websites. They do have some parent accounts. In this case, Yale doesn't have a parent account. But if you look at this next additional section, this is some great information about the school that we can use for multiple purposes. There's two new unique identifiers that we can use for linking from other data sources. We haven't had that requirement yet, but now that we have them in Salesforce, we can use those as keys. But for reporting, we can start to ask questions. What applicants came from public universities, from historically Black colleges and universities? Are they coming from exclusively post-secondary schools or private or public institutions? As a totally free data source, this has just allowed us to create and think about some outputs we would not have had before. So that's interesting, definitely worth checking out. Another piece of the report to highlight here are these summary statistics around diversity information. Anytime we hear diversity, the data around that is quite sensitive. And we had to come up with a way that we could generate this report here, highlighting some of the specific groups that the medical school is interested in, without giving the individual person access to the underlying demographic data, which is very sensitive. So business needed to see the summary while keeping the actual data itself private. One of our challenges was the fact we're using the EDA data model, which has those demographics stored on the contact record, and it would be manual entry for non-Harvard contacts. So there's quite a bit of the nuance in where this data was coming from and how we were going to use it. So to solve this, using basic Salesforce tools around field level security to really restrict access to those sensitive fields. So yes, you can see the record, but no, you can't see the field. And then leveraging rollups to create real-time summary statistics. So anytime an applicant is added, a committee member is changed, we're going to calculate those summary statistics and store them back on the search record itself. That way we can disconnect the two. You can see the summary statistics, but not the underlying data that supported it. In the future, I think this is a lesson learned for us, that by having the fields on the contact record limited us in terms of our ability to enter new information. So I can imagine moving to a custom object to hold that demographic data. That would allow us to replicate not only who can see specific fields, but then who can see specific records. Since we couldn't prevent access to the contacts, that did not work for us now. So that's an area where we can work on. Thinking about using within the E2Data architecture, definitely think about your business cases to see if it's something you might want to do as well. Then to share some of our key successes outside of the technical space, I was going to hand it back to Jen to share some of her findings.
Thanks, Patrick. So as I mentioned, we had some thought leaders across very senior level positions at both the school and also across the hospitals. And so having executive involvement, understanding the vision of the project and the goals and objectives are major to accomplishing such a large, not only technology change, but culture change. And so I mentioned earlier in my introduction, as well as Patrick did, we also had built a strong partnership with Attain, who is also a sponsor of today's event. And they have been helping us in a strategic oversight manner, helping us really to think through. We have a large roadmap for where we want to go with this platform. We're trying to stay on one org. And so as Patrick mentioned, that leads to a lot of different challenges to think through the architecture. So we're not reinventing it every time we have a new module. We are agile. Again, Patrick mentioned some of this already, but it allows us to really be fairly flexible and iterative with what we're building in terms of the foundation and the building blocks in the future. And then it also helps really with roles and responsibilities. We have very strong business roles and responsibilities, which has led to resolving open questions and making swift decisions. We have communication, transparency. We had a lot of knowledge transfer when folks moved on. We have a knowledge base that we're using that users can have access to out in the hospitals, because we don't necessarily know who's coming and going from the hospitals. And so we can offer trainings periodically, but we don't know when these searches are coming up. We don't know when a new user is going to be joining the platform. And so having, those training materials available, job aids available, have really been helpful to us. I will say we rolled out in a pilot manner. So we picked one department within each affiliated hospital before rolling out to every department in the hospital. And now this January, we're continuing the expansion to more departments. It's an iterative rollout, and all departments should be on the platform by the end of the spring, early summer. So I'll turn it back to Patrick if he has any last thoughts.
I think that wraps up the presentation, so I can pull up our last slide here, just say thank you, and we're going to hand it back to Dean.
Great. Thank you, Patrick and Jennifer. Fantastic presentation. Very interesting. We did have a few questions come in while you were going through that presentation. One of them was, have you had any issues related to approaching the max number of sharing rules per object? Because you did mention that private was the org-wide default for a lot of your objects?
Good question. No, we fortunately have not run into that yet, that we've been able to create pretty large buckets for those sharing rules. And often the sharing rules are selecting the records, not so much the user who's having access. And so, for example, with contacts, some of our contacts have a privacy flag that means no, we can't share them internally. And the sharing rule is what is being used to select those records and then sharing them with all users as appropriate.
Great. We had another question coming in about the Experience Cloud piece of this. Meredith Aronson. So I'd love to hear where you might have found any limitations on the Experience Cloud side in terms of delivering functionality or workarounds that you came up with to address those shortcomings.
Yeah, also a great question. This is my first Experience Cloud-based launch, so I definitely have learned quite a bit. As a platform owner, I always try to go declarative first, and the core platform is getting much better at that, but we ran into a couple of cases had to change our expectations in the cloud-based interface. Off the top of my head, a couple of the examples would be users would want to see in a related list a longer list of things, all of them, and not have to click a second button to get over there. Yes, we could solve that with a custom Lightning Web Component. We decided not to and have documentation around that for now. Another one is kind of around flows, that there are definitely times that flows act differently in Experience Cloud, particularly around our document generation, that is a flow-based mechanism. We ended up having to have 3 different processes to kick everything off correctly because they kick off in different environments depending on where they're activated from, and also then the licensing time back to Conga. So yes, there were different issues we ran into. We managed to get through most of them. It'll be interesting to see what happens now that the pilot is closed and we're out to a larger audience, what sort of feedback we get. We can imagine some changes happening because of that.
Great. And kind of a tag on to that, in terms of your licensing for Experience Cloud, that can be kind of confusing, as you alluded to, for many of us. So what licensing did you end up going with and why?
Good question. So we are using login licenses, and they are the Community Plus licensing. I might be having that exact wording a little bit off. The reason we did that is we need to have access to sharing rules to get our records shared out correctly, because the hospital administrators themselves can share records with other users. And we wanted to be able to share out dashboards and reports. So that was where the business drivers really drove that matrix of deciding what licenses to get. As we think about other portals that we're exploring, I think we can dial that back and get a cheaper license that doesn't require that. It will be an overhead of maintaining that and linking a persona to the correct license. But we did have to go with that Plus license to get the features we needed.
Great. And we've just got a minute or so left here, but what do you see next for this project?
I can take that. So our vision is to really have a faculty information system. We've been, in different sessions where we hear about Faculty 360. We sometimes refer to it as a faculty portal. We're extending our relationship with Faculty Affairs to look at what is the appointment and the reappointment process. So there's this initial search for hire, which leads you to the first appointment. And then depending on the type of position that you are in, you need annual reappointments. And then there's also the promotions process. So as a ladder faculty, there's different milestones to go up the ladder that are very well defined by junior and senior faculty ladders. And so we're looking at, hopefully, right now a lot of the processes are email based. And so we're hoping to put it on one single platform, that there could be a two-way exchange between Faculty Affairs and the faculty in the hospitals, as well as their administrative staff that support them. We're also looking at things like, how can we assist with career advising of faculty? There are different departments within each hospital that come together and talk about career advising. We're also looking at other faculty attributes that we could be tracking. So we're not leveraging ORCID the way we could be for publications tracking and PubMed from NIH. We're looking at tracking student and faculty opportunities so that we understand which projects faculty have that students can be mentored on. So there's a whole host of different projects that we're looking to expand the platform for.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you and to all of our attendees. Thank you for joining us. At this point, you can head back to the main stage or the agenda to find your next session. You can join a networking table to talk to others, and certainly visit our sponsors in the booths as well. Thank you very much.